Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the role of the European Union in its Eastern Neighbourhood. My name is Maili Vilson and I am a researcher at the Johan Institute of Political Studies of the University of Tartu. In this lecture, I will give a brief overview of the EU's engagement with the Eastern Neighbourhood since the early 2000s. I will focus on two aspects in particular. The first is the the European Neighbourhood Policy and the Eastern Partnership as a logic and framework for EU's engagement with its neighbours. And secondly, I will discuss some of the main aspects of these policies to give you an idea how has the EU tried to engage with its neighbours. Most of this information may be familiar to you if you have studied EU foreign policy or politics of Eastern European countries before. However, it is essential that we establish some basic facts before you go any deeper with the political analysis in your next sessions. And let us first start with a bit of historical context. In order to understand the EU's engagement with the neighbourhood, we have to go back to the early 1990s. It was the time of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Many countries in the Central and Eastern Europe became independent again and started their processes of transition, which were often really complex. So there was the political transition from an autocratic regime to a democratic one. There was the economic transition from the socialized, centralized economy to capitalism. And in addition, there were various state building and nation building processes and coming to terms with the Soviet past. One element of this was also reintegration with the West, which became the main foreign policy goal for most Central and Eastern European countries, to again become part of the rest of Europe and the West more general. And this was the opportunity for the European Union to support the transformation of the region. And as a result of that, they also recognized the membership perspective for Central and Eastern European countries. This way, in 2000s, there were two rounds of enlargement, in 2004 and in 2007, when altogether 10 Central and Eastern European countries joined the European Union. And for the sake of our discussion to come, then let's also think which countries these were to understand the sort of geography. And the Central Eastern European countries which joined the European Union in the early 2000s, there were 10 of them, were Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, Bulgaria and Romania. So what this actually meant for the European Union was that it really was a new reality for Europe and for the governance of the European Union. It meant that there was a completely new political landscape. There were new member states who came with their own ideas and their interests, and also the external border of the EU moved further east, which meant that the EU had completely new neighbors with whom it had never properly engaged with before. So it was clear that in order to plan for its foreign policy, the EU needed to also think of its neighbors. It was also clear at the time that there was no immediate perspective for further enlargement at the time. Therefore, there was a real need for a neighborhood policy or something to use as a policy framework to engage with its new neighbors. And as a result of that, In 2003, European Commission published a communication titled Wider Europe, and it proposed to do exactly that, to have a new policy framework aimed at neighbors in EU's eastern and southern border. So that meant Eastern Europe, but also Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. And formally, the policy was launched in 2004, and it became known as European Neighbourhood Policy. And let me just quote to you the goals from the European Neighbourhood Policy strategy paper, which explain what was the aim of the policy for the European Union. It is designed to prevent the emergence of new dividing lines between the enlarged EU and its neighbours, and to offer them the chance to participate in various EU activities through greater political, security, economic and cultural cooperation. So we will come back shortly and hear a bit more about how did the EU actually do it. But for now, I would also like to mention the next stage in the relationship between the EU and its neighbors. And this came about 5 years later, in 2009, at the initiative of Sweden and Poland, when the Eastern Partnership was launched. And now Eastern Partnership is also a policy framework. It is in the wider logic of European Neighbourhood Policy, the ENP, but it only focused on the eastern dimension. The logic behind it was that therefore this way the EU can better achieve its aims and improve its relations with its eastern neighbours further. Initially there were 6 members designed for the Eastern Partnership. Those were Ukraine, Moldova and Belarus in Eastern Europe, and Armenia, Azerbaijan and Georgia in the South Caucasus. However, Belarus suspended its participation later, so it never really took part in it, but it's nevertheless often mentioned as one of the Eastern Partnership countries. And this is useful for us simply if we think about the range of political trajectories in the region, just to have this idea how different these 6 countries have been. It is also worthwhile to mention that Russia was never part of the European Neighbourhood Policy and also not part of the Eastern Partnership. Instead, Russia and the EU conducted its relations bilaterally, so not in the framework of this policy. So what did the EU want to achieve with its neighbourhood policy, and how did it do that? There are many aspects to consider here, and we won't be able to touch all of them or even go too much in depth. But there are still a couple of things that we can cover here. So let's first start with the goals. The main goals of Eastern Partnership and also the neighbourhood policy towards the Eastern neighbours were the following. So there were altogether 3. First, to create a common space of stability, security and prosperity. Second, to avoid new dividing lines in Europe. And third, to increase coherence and efficiency of EU's approach. And now let's look at all these 3 a bit closer. And let's first start with the space of stability, security and prosperity. This goal, as you can probably also imagine, includes both an external as well as a domestic dimension both from the perspective of the EU as well as from the perspective of the neighbourhood countries that were part of the policy. If we think of stability and security, then there is no doubt about it that it was in the interest of all to have a well-governed region To an extent, we can also say that the ENP was much about security. The idea was to ensure that the neighborhood countries are developing peacefully, and in order to do that, they needed to also address the conflicts or the crises which come along to solve them peacefully. It was also about the security of EU's external border. If we think of, say, for example, organized crime or human trafficking or other issues, then certainly this was one motivation behind the neighborhood policy. Another one was definitely to encourage the domestic change in neighborhood countries. And by that, what was meant is the focus on political and economic reforms and general modernization of the country. So if you think in terms of democratic reforms, we can say, for example, public administration, how to root out corruption, how to build up a system of rule of law. Regarding economic reforms, let's say building up market economy, how to build up your agricultural sector, various social reforms. So it's actually a wide range of activities that can support the democratic development. And a second part of this domestic development, I would say, is also supporting the civil society. So the capacity building for civil society, because they are the ones who provide this public accountability to those who are governing. They can monitor the reforms, that human rights are protected. So overall, it is a crucial feature of any democratic regime to have a very strong civil society. So capacity building in terms of civil society is definitely also one of the aspects which EU paid much attention to. And how did it do most of these things, or how did the EU motivate the partner countries to do that? It was one really important point here is, for example, providing assistance. So we're talking about financial and technical assistance. In order to conduct such reforms, you not only need advice on how to build your rule of law system up, but you also need to think about the structure more broadly. So what do you need in order to have this corruption-free environment, for example? So it is also a lot about financial assistance. And this was done through the European Neighbourhood and Partnership Instrument. Now, when we talk about more specifically how this EU induced domestic change took place, then we can identify two tracks within the policy. One is a bilateral track, so between the EU and the third country or the partner country specifically. And the other one is a multilateral track, so between the EU and the 6 partner countries together, sort of a regional approach. We can say today that the regional or multilateral track hasn't been high success, whereas the bilateral track is the one that has proven most useful so far. Therefore, let's talk a little bit more about what this bilateral track means. So the basis for cooperation for EU and the partner country is some sort of cooperation agreement. Later, with countries where the EU cooperated most, the basis for such interaction was the association agreement. Based on that, the EU and the partner country agreed on certain goals, which, for example, certain reforms which the partner country would be involved in. There were annual action plans that devised the course of action, and then the EU, the European Commission more specifically, also then kept track of these action plans annually. And after that, further plans were devised, or the plans were redesigned in case the reforms didn't go through as planned. And here it is important to mention the more for more principle. What this meant was that this was the way how progress was measured by the EU and also rewarded by the EU. So if the partner country made progress on the agreed reforms, this was rewarded by more support from the EU. This could be financial support, but it also could be other kinds of actions, for example, visa freedom, or a free trade agreement and some access to the European Union's internal market. So the logic behind this was that there were countries who also chose to do more, and this way they also gained more. For example, visa freedom has been so far won by Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia. However, there is one element about this which sometimes in the literature is also criticized, and this concerns the coherence of the policy. So on the one hand, what the EU did was that it applied a very similar logic for all countries. Yes, there were some differences in terms of what kind of goals were agreed based on countries, but overall the countries were treated the same. And this caused quite a bit of dissatisfaction among these countries, because not everyone felt that they were treated right in that sense. But where does this logic come from to treat all countries the same and to have this sort of annual action plan and keeping track of these milestones? It actually comes from the enlargement policy. So despite the fact that the EU decided that it is not going to enlarge anytime soon, it still took the same policy that it had and applied it to those neighbors. So it's really important to recognize here that the neighbourhood policy is not about EU membership, although today we maybe can say differently, and I'm sure it will be discussed in the next sessions. But here I would like to bring in one important concept, and that is the concept of external governance. External governance means essentially that the EU is trying to influence or shape a third country through its engagement with this country without giving the EU membership to these countries. So it's the same things that we discussed before. There is a political track in terms of good governance. There is the economic track with access to, say, internal market. There are the people-to-people contacts, whether it's visa liberalization or civil society contacts. So basically, these partner countries were receiving or were part of the EU, but not members of the EU. And this is one really crucial element when we try to understand the policy. One more thing I would like to address before I conclude concerns the effectiveness of the policy in general. So we won't have time to discuss this at length, but it is important to emphasize that obviously the EU's neighbourhood policy didn't work the same way in all countries, and you will see that in the next sessions as well. Why is that? I already mentioned some of the things related to the EU side, so the EU's too general approach to its relations with its neighbors. There were also some tensions inside the EU about policy. There were some member states that were more interested in the EU's policy towards North Africa, for example, and considered that much more important. There is obviously the role of Russia in EU's relations with these countries. And of course, it's the domestic developments and internal conflicts in these partner countries. Today, we know that some of these neighborhood countries have indeed applied for EU membership, but this, I would say, is a later trend and not necessarily related to how the neighborhood policy was designed in the beginning. So to sum up, there are 3 points that I would like to emphasize from my talk. First of all, it's been 20 years now that the EU has been engaged in the neighborhood through the European Neighbourhood Policy and Eastern Partnership. The aim of the policy has been to promote security, stability and prosperity in the region. It was done through principles of external governance, bilateral relations between the EU and its neighbors, and the results are mixed in terms of effectiveness. With this, I will conclude for today regarding the European Neighbourhood Policy. Thank you very much for watching. The next session will focus on the specific challenges to democracy for various neighbourhood countries.